So to the Arctic. As temperatures rise, tensions rise. Because of melting, we have new shipping channels opening. Now these tremendous energy and mineral resources are more easily accessible. Fish migratory patterns are changing. And because this is happening, the geopolitical stakes are higher and the geopolitical tensions are higher. I'm Jeanne Meserve. I am host of the NatSec Tech podcast. Let me introduce my fantastic panel here. Next to me, a man you all know, Minister Bill Blair, Canada's Minister of Defense. Next to him, Admiral Linda Fagan, who is Commandant of the US Coast Guard. Then we have Minister Espen Barth, Eide, Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Madeleine Redfern. She is COO of CanArctic Inuit Networks, Inc. Thank you all for being here. Minister Eide, I want to start with you because you told me that you were at the very first Halifax Forum talking about the Arctic. What's changed? What hasn't?
Exactly. When I was preparing for this, I reminded myself that I was here 15 years ago at the very first Halifax, at the first Arctic panel, obviously, is the first. And I was watching it again because it's online, and it struck me that there's continuity and change. And to be very quick on that, we did realize the melting ice. We saw climate change. We understood there will be more activity, also from non-Arctic states. We understood we needed to do more management. We talked about cooperation, including with Russia, by the way. But what we excluded explicitly in this conversation, we included the then showed Walter Natunchik and the head of NORAD, Renard at the time, is that we did not think it was an area for classical security challenges. We talked about the new ones, the sort of the non-traditional challenges. And I think much of what we said is still true, but with the added fact that now the Arctic is again relevant in hard security. Not as a source of conflict. This is not the South China Sea. There's actually very few, or if relevant, outstanding disputes on territory or economic zones. That's all been solved, particularly because Canada has now solved this deep crisis with Denmark over the Hans Island. So you now have a border with Denmark. But if there is a hotter conflict between Russia and the West, the Arctic will once again become an area for submarines, for missiles, for surveillance, for sea lines of communication. And the Arctic connects Asia, Europe, and America. There's no sea that brings us closer than the Arctic. And when the ice is melting, it's just the sea. Hence, it's very relevant to continue to talk about the Arctic.
Minister Blair, you mentioned the Arctic yesterday in your remarks. Could you give us a little bit more granularity, we've just gotten some, about the military importance of the Arctic? Why is it so critical?
I think very clearly the strategic importance of the entire Arctic is of significant concern to us. Our most recent defense policy focused very exclusively on our responsibilities in a document we entitled Our North Strong and Free. I think there are three elements that are emerging that are deeply concerning to us with respect to its security. One is climate change. Clearly, the area is becoming far more accessible as the sea ice melts and the permafrost melts. We believe that the Arctic Ocean could very easily become the main point of transit between Europe and Asia as a trade route in the coming decades. And we're also seeing the activities of two particular adversaries, China and Russia, in the area, which are deeply concerning to us. And frankly, their aggression and assertions in the region are somewhat different. We're seeing from Russia, very typically, sailing through the region, they have not demonstrated respect for the international rules-based order and respect for other countries' sovereignty and economic interests. And so we have, for many years, been able to respond to that. But Russia also has 17 deep water ports on that ocean. Canada has none. And so we need to do better. They also have significant additional capabilities in icebreakers and military presence in the region. We're also seeing now through China a very significant new investment. And China approaches our Arctic in two different ways. One of them is through economic pressure, investing in critical infrastructure and investment in other infrastructure in the region. And the second one is through what they term scientific research. And we've seen a huge increase in their presence in the Arctic. And it's not just scientific research. They're mapping the seafloor. They're gathering intelligence.
Madeleine Redfern, the indigenous community has a sort of more existential concern about changes in the Arctic. Talk about the threat to your communities, to your culture that all of this poses?
I think the minister raised it yesterday in so much as that one of the main sort of priorities for our communities is the lack of infrastructure. So we don't have the stable or necessary power or telecommunications or transportation. And so with NORAD modernization, what we're hoping, including with the other investments that the Government of Canada plans to make, is that it is strategic, that it meets the needs of our communities, our residents, our businesses, but also that it meets the needs of our national and international security requirements. But the challenge is breaking down the inherent government silos. So we hear a lot about the necessity for dual purpose or multi-purpose infrastructure, but I can tell you as someone who has worked with government inside and out, is that breaking those silos down, no one knows how to do it. And that is the real challenge.
Admiral Fagan, the Coast Guard is the eyes and ears of the US government in the Arctic. What have you been seeing from Russia and China that has got your antenna waving?
Yeah, so we operate the nation's surface fleet. Obviously, the Navy operates submarines, but what we have seen is a dramatic shift in patterns and departure from standard behaviors. Up until this past summer, you would expect one Chinese research vessel in the Arctic. This past summer, there were 5. You would see Russia operating, you would see China operating. This summer, they were operating in tandem. Surface action groups with both China and Russia, 60 to 70 miles off the coast of Alaska, the Aleutians. If we were to see that same pattern of behavior off the east or the west coast of the United States, it would have the attention of the United States. I should emphasize, the United States is an Arctic nation, right? This isn't notional. We are an Arctic nation, and this is about national sovereignty and national defense and ensuring our ability to protect our own exclusive economic zone as it pertains to the Arctic. You asked earlier, what's changed and what's different? So activity has changed. Shifting patterns of activity have changed. Some of the governance, though, and international system and structure around how we govern the Arctic has not changed. We do have great international collaborative forums like the Arctic Council, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, yet the Chinese research vessels are operating in and along our extended outer continental shelf claim, an extended outer continental shelf claim that we don't have a seat at the table as not being signatory to the law of the sea.
Norway, I'm sure, as a neighbor of Russia, as well as an Arctic nation, is observing a lot as well. Give us your perspective.
So, you know, the most important naval base of Russia is just outside our door in Kola. And the second strike capacity, the submarine-based second strike nuclear capacity is also there. And most of the advanced military testing of equipment happens in our vicinity. So we are eyes and ears on behalf of our friends also to what's happening there, and we have a rather good insight. So we see that activity. We have seen these territories being emptied of land forces because they're all in Ukraine. But the air, tech and naval activity is as it's always been, and we see more flights. And we know that Russia would, in a broader conflict, they would need to secure their bases. And to our discomfort, that securing would happen way further west than we would like it to see. So this is a scenario that we used to think about in the Cold War, which is coming back in many ways, which is also an Arctic theme. But I also like to say we need to deal with that. We are now 7 of the 8 Arctic countries in the world are NATO countries. It's really great that Sweden and Finland has joined, because that means that NATO is now even more also an Arctic alliance, and we need to think about it as such. And I'm very happy that the Canadian government is now much more involved in discussing that than what used to be the case. So that's really, really something we welcome, and we have a conversation of that, because we can do Arctic Council on the other stuff, which remains meaningful to work across. But we also have certain themes that will not fit into that format.
So what are the other fora? Where else can you talk?
Well, we don't really, we have NATO, of course.
You said that very quickly.
Huh?
You said that very quickly. We have NATO.
Because the 7 countries I speak about are members of NATO.
I understand. Yeah. But I'm just wondering if their role should be more prominent.
But of course, we could not really expect that Portugal and Greece why would they take a particularly strong interest? So we also need to have some kind of soft format between defense minister, foreign ministers to talk about that. We don't need a new organization, but we need to have a structured cooperation. And I was very happy to go to Iqaluit, your hometown, together with Melanie Joly, the foreign minister here, and the 5 Nordics. The US was invited. They couldn't come. They were interested. But the thing was exactly to have a conversation about these issues from an allied perspective. And that's, I think, a very good development, and I welcome it.
And if I may jump in, the NATO defense ministers have also convened a table.
Yeah.
And the advent of Finland and Sweden, I think, is a bit of a game changer for us. The fact that they have now joined NATO, it gives us an enormous opportunity for better collaboration, better cooperation, working stronger together. They have remarkable capabilities that they also bring to the table. And so I think we're very much stronger as a result.
Although some people have said, in addition to Ukraine, that the accession of Finland and Sweden are one of the things that have driven Russia and China to collaborate more in the Arctic region. Do you buy that?
Well, that collaboration was already taking place. And I think the threat and the risk environment was significantly increasing for us. I think the response of all of the NATO allies, including the accession of Finland and Sweden, is an appropriate and necessary response to that challenge. If I also may, we talked about some of the emerging challenges. One of the things that has also changed, and it's something we've learned from the Ukraine and from the recent attacks into Israel, and it's the technology that is now also creating new vulnerabilities for all of our countries. You know, for many years we had the DO line through NORAD, and it was incredibly important and helpful. But we are now undertaking a significant new investment in NORAD modernization, which is going to give us better situational awareness in the Arctic, over the horizon, over the polar radars, new installations, and I think it's moving us through the absolute necessity of a greater integrated air and missile defense network across all NATO allies to protect us in the northern sphere.
Exactly, and you know, half of the Arctic coast is actually Russia, so no wonder they're more active. They have to, actually, because one feature of climate change is that the permafrost is melting, which means a lot of the infrastructure in North Russia, that means rail, road, airfields, small cities, are breaking up, literally, now, not in the future. That means that more transport is being moved to the sea, which is more accessible because the ice is melting. So, in a sense, they are doomed to do more of their normal business, this destination traffic, not only through traffic, through ports in the north, but they are way ahead of some other of these countries. Our ports are very well prepared because we've been active we live in the Arctic, we have large cities, a lot of activity, all our ports are ice-free because of the Gulf Stream, so we have a different Arctic in many ways than the one we saw in Iqaluit. But I think here it's going to be in Alaska and in Canada, there's a lot of work to do, as I see it, to get to that level.
So 2 sort of reactions to the conversation here. So first, right, we're talking about this in terms of defense, chiefs of defense, NATO, navies. United States Coast Guard is not part of our Defense Department. We sit in the Department of Homeland Security. So just a organizational caveat. I will highlight I am the 3rd largest Navy in NATO as we look at how we operate and think about the Arctic. To the point with regard to technology, I couldn't agree more. There's a step function, a jumping function that we've got an opportunity, particularly in the U.S. and Canada, to do. Building a building, we talk about the white buildings with red roofs, which is how we've traditionally operated the Coast Guard. That is not what right looks like in the Arctic, but as you consider what types of deep water access, what kinds of maritime domain awareness, communications technology, and logistics and resupply might we need to create the opportunity for year-round presence in the Arctic. That is all work in front of us, but I see real opportunity there. We're not bound by old infrastructure in many cases.
I want to ask you about investment. The Chinese are famous for going into different regions of the world and spending a lot of money. Have they been trying to make investments in indigenous communities, and have they been successful?
Absolutely. So it was only in 2019 that Huawei actually partnered with a Canadian company in an attempt to actually improve connectivity in the north. I was one of the actual sort of critics that spoke out and was like, what the? No, this should not happen, not only because we deserve security at the personal and individual and regional, but also national level. but also we had a Chinese company, Shandong, that wanted to buy TMAC, which was a gold mine in our western part of Nunavut. And again, you know, I spoke out and going like, absolutely not. We should not support the sale of this to the Chinese. I was aware, because they've advertised it through their Polar Silk Road strategy, is that they have, you know, intense interest in the Arctic, and they're looking for the weakest links. And I remember sort of saying to my leaders at the time is that, you know, we have to be cautious and very aware that they're playing the long game, that there are environmental, you know, practices of China or human rights violations, and generally we don't want that level of sort of vulnerability or perceived or realized risk in our region. And I recall one of my leaders at the time sort of saying, well, it doesn't really matter as long as they respect our human rights. And I was like, excuse me? So we actually need to build up a lot more awareness and capacity in our own Northern Indigenous leadership, whether it's in government or in our businesses or in our development corporations and our organizations, because there are risks there if there is not that level of awareness. And I remember then Premier also, Savikatak, lovely man, and I don't want to disparage him, but I do recall when asked about sort of foreign investment and the risks associated with that, his response was that that is the federal government's responsibility. And there was an expectation that the, you know, federally, they would assess these risks and protect us. And I do think
happening?
Well, I think it's all our responsibility. We all have to scale up, but there is a leadership role that absolutely the federal government has to play.
You want to respond?
I vigorously agree with everything that Madeleine has said, and it is a federal responsibility in many respects. We have the investment of CanArctic, and we've used it. We've used it many times to deny China a foothold in Canada in investment and critical infrastructure. But it is even beyond that. I think when we go to an Indigenous community and say we're going to deny the Chinese the opportunity to come in and invest in your community, they quite rightfully turn to us and say, well, okay, if not them, who else? Who's coming? And that's what I think we also have to step up into that space. We're also deeply concerned about access to critical minerals.
Yes.
China overwhelmingly dominates the critical mineral market, and in both extraction and production, they are quite capable of holding us hostage. We have the capacity in our country, and along with in partnership with our allies, to really respond appropriately to that. But it's got to be done in such a way that is also respectful of the people who live in those communities. And that's one of the reasons the conversations between Madeleine and our communities is so important.
Minister, you have an Indigenous community as well. What's
Indeed,
the relationship?
Sami population principally, and indeed one of the things that was a good thing about the Arctic Council is that it had a clear space for Indigenous people, a lot of communication between them through the Arctic Council, which is one of the reasons it's good that we maintain it, I mean, with all the challenges we currently have. So I think when we talk about another conversation about other issues, it should not replace the Arctic Council, which I incidentally currently chair, but it should be in addition, because we would like to keep that for what it can still do. And the new conversations we need to have should also remember the interests of Indigenous peoples, because it's hard to tell people don't take that investment and then not offer anything else. That's not a very compelling argument. So I think we have to take very seriously that if we want to prevent something from happening, we might want to offer something else.
The U.S. Approach has been articulated as monitor and respond. You're the agency that would do that. As I understand it, you only have one Arctic-capable icebreaker. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I've been in uniform over 40 years, and my first assignment as a much younger person than I sit here right now was on the Polar Star, the United States' only heavy icebreaker. And that ship will get ready to depart from Seattle to sail for Antarctica. And I do want to plant with the audience, the national sovereignty concerns of each of us is equally as concerning in Antarctica with regard to Chinese activity and their soon-to-open deepwater port. So as a nation, we have one heavy icebreaker. The Healy is the medium icebreaker. She's actually underway in the Arctic right now. The logical follow-on question to this is, so are we where we need to be? And the short answer is, we're behind. We are behind. as
Way
the United-
behind. How many cutters does Russia have?
So,
Or
yeah,
icebreakers,
way
icebreakers?
more than one.
It's in the vicinity of 40, I think.
It's close to 40. So, but I do want to share some good news. Just in the last 3 days, we have signed the contract to acquire the commercially available icebreaker. It's currently commissioned as the IVIC. It has operated in the Arctic before. We have inked that deal, and I am really excited that the United States Coast Guard will operate that cutter on behalf of the nation. Polar security cutter, we've contracted with the yard. We're very close to having the kind of design maturity that you need to begin actual full production. We are behind. And I want to also put a plug in for Ice Pact. Very exciting sign between the United States, Canada, Finland just last week. Opens the door for the kind of collaboration and partnership and allyship that is truly our competitive advantage as we work closely and more closely together as nations.
So what's the timeline for these cutters? When are you going to see a serious number deployed? Not cutters,
So
breakers,
I will not put a number on a serious number. The commercial icebreaker will be at initial operating capacity. You should see her in the Arctic in 26. Polar security cutter, though, we're 4+ years away from that once we begin significant construction. And there is, at this point, no follow-on budget or appropriated support for a second polar security cutter. We are behind as a nation. This isn't an Alaska issue. This is a United States sovereignty and defense issue as it pertains to the Arctic.
What kind of capabilities does Canada have militarily?
Actually, better than that. We've just down the road from here. Well, it's hard. It's better than one is not that anything to brag about. But just down the road from here, we are putting in the water next week our 6th Arctic offshore patrol vessel, which doesn't have deep ice capabilities, but has significant accessibility into the Arctic. We are also in the process of constructing another one. Canada has a fairly robust capability through our national shipbuilding strategy in building icebreakers. And just last year, one of our large shipbuilding industries based in Quebec acquired a shipyard in Helsinki that's part of the Ice Pack arrangement that includes all the capability and design that we think is going to be really helpful. And I'm hugely encouraged. I think there are some real challenges in shipbuilding in all of our nations, but working together, we're going to do this better and smarter, and we're all seized with a sense of urgency.
Can the Nordics compensate?
So, our Navy and Coast Guard have ice-capable, ice-enhanced ships, but we actually don't need icebreakers in our area, in the Norway's area of responsibility, simply because the ice is gone, it's moved. Because when the ice melts, it's not only melting, it's also moving around. So we have free water, but we need to be able to occasionally meet ice. However, our Baltic friends are still into the business of icebreakers, and I'm sure they will be very interested in cooperating.
So Admiral, I'm curious if by the time you get the icebreakers built, there isn't any ice. Will it have been a wasted investment?
So I do get asked this question periodically. So, we are a long ways from a completely ice-free Arctic. That's not to say it won't come at some point, but the ability to create year-round presence from a sovereignty and defense standpoint requires heavy icebreakers. It requires it now and into the foreseeable future. And so this is not a wasted effort. We need to accelerate. We need to continue the partnership. I was in Norway meeting with the Norwegian Coast Guard earlier this year, and the new Jan Mayen class Norwegian Coast Guard cutters, they are ice hardened.
Yes.
They are impressive. And I think the Romanians built them and then outfitted in Norway. But it speaks to how we collaborate and partner for best capacity and effects so that we can speed.
So these vessels can deal with ice, but they are not supposed to open simply because we don't need it, but you need it because the nature of the Arctic depends on where you are in the Arctic, and we have the particular phenomenon of the Gulf Stream, which means that it's actually much warmer further north than what it would be in Alaska and North Canada, and for good and bad.
Minister, you have talked a lot over the years, including here, about the need for investment in the Canadian military. I think you used the word death spiral at one point to describe the state of the Canadian military.
Yeah, probably a little more provocative than I intended, but it had the effect I intended.
Which was to boost spending?
Well, to boost spending, but also to create a sense of urgency. And when I talked about the death spiral, I was talking about staffing. I think the most important investment we make in defense is in our people. We need great people and we need great skills in order to deliver on our promise and our responsibilities of national defense. And so I was really trying to just encourage the Canadian Armed Forces to, we can do this better. And I wanted them to know that they would have the support of their government and me to do what is required. And so that's what we're talking about. But let me also acknowledge, as I have in this forum many times, we need to do much more. And that involves spending a lot more money. But it needs to, like the quantum of expenditure, it's important. It's a metric we've committed to. But we also need to have a conversation about what we invest in. And we're finding that in that investment, for example, in the Arctic, I went to the north. I'm from Toronto, and I went to the north, and I had my own idea of what Arctic security and sovereignty really was about, and I was wrong. And it was Northerners who sat down with me and said, no, Bill, it's about infrastructure. It's about airport runways. It's about highways. It's about fiber optic communications. It's about energy plants. It's about all of the things that make our presence there sustainable and prosperous. And it really was, I think, it was a game changer for me. And I also realized I was about to make big investments in the Arctic, in the north, and there was an opportunity through multi-use infrastructure. And so I will tell you, I went to the northern premiers, I went to the indigenous communities, and I said, help me get this right, and I want to do this. And we had them all in, and we gave them actually a very secure briefing on, here's the threat environment we're dealing with, now work with us. And the partnerships that are evolving now are really, really helpful. They're going to help us get it right.
Madeleine, are they doing it right?
I would say it's mixed. I am the perpetual optimistic cynic, in so much as that I'm forever hopeful that we can actually do better. But rolling it out still poses a bit of a challenge, in so much as that, I look to the Iqaluit port. Significant investment from the federal government, so thank you for that, because we are desperate for any improvements. However, it was disappointing when our territorial government, because I was mayor at the time, failed to actually consult with local governments and didn't actually consider, how that investment could actually be a force multiplier. So they didn't talk to the fisheries. And all our Arctic fisheries, for the most part, is landed in Greenland or in the Atlantic provinces. They didn't talk to the cruise ship industry, and they didn't talk to the Navy and the Coast Guard. So, there can be breakdowns, unfortunately, and also I was quite surprised, because I think that that investment might have been better if we'd actually put that port a little further down the bay and actually had a year-round port with a road that would have been absolutely transformative in bringing goods up, 365 days a year, similar to what you have in the Nordic countries or even in Nuuk in Greenland. But, so we need to learn from our lessons. The other, I would say, inherent risk that I struggle with as someone who lives in the north is that we have a high transiency rate, not only of people who come to the north to work there and be in our governments or in our organizations, but we also have a high transiency rate in our federal bureaucracy. So it's challenging when you're constantly having new people come in and they don't know what they don't know. And so we're exhausted in the north of continuously trying to inform Ottawa in particular, or even sort of southern businesses who want to do business in the north, about what our priorities in reality are. And so we got a lot of work to do. But as I said, I think if we all sort of come together and sit at the table and it's not a partisan issue. It's about how do we make sure that the investments that are done by the Government of Canada and our territorial government and our businesses and our financial sector, stop making the mistakes of the past.
I want to, because this is very familiar for me, because we're a founding father of NATO, 75 years membership, almost all that time until a few years ago. We were alone up there as a NATO member, bordering Russia, bordering the Barents Sea, and presence of people, activity, life, everyday life, indigenous and non-indigenous life, economy it's really important. So you can't just replace that with some military presence. You need that too. But actually to use these territories is the best way to look after them. So that I very much look forward to the Canada's Arctic strategy or Arctic white paper or whatever it is. Because I think there are a lot of things from our experience which is relevant for that conversation here. And I would think the same for North US, because what's very useful, I think, is to look at a map of the world, not the classical one, but start with the pole in the center. Because the classical map gives you the impression that the world ends. But actually it continues after the pole. And it's not so far away. I mean, China is closer that way. Russia is there all the time. So to have that approach, you understand that you're actually quite close to this territory that we're talking about. And you need to have that presence. And the presence is also civilian life and normal economy and military surveillance and ports.
We talked a little bit about workforce. I want to reflect on that beyond, the vibrant communities and people who live and work in the communities. Myself, as a military force, we've had a recruiting challenge, the same as the other U.S. militaries. And this is not unique as I travel around the world and talk to other navies and Coast Guards. Workforce, the people talent, the people resource is the existential threat. They're not there. The 18-year-olds that the universities need to recruit, that I need to recruit, that the shipyard needs to build the ship and repair the ship, that pick an element of our defense industrial base, the kinds of industries that are needed to enable what we're talking about here. The workforce element of this has to come first. That new polar security cutter, where I would love to have it now, if I don't have people, it doesn't matter. You need people to operate those pieces of steel, to operate the technology. And so thinking about how we excite young people into service, whether it's in uniform, into service in the government, or into service in the defense industrial base and industries that are enabling our economic security, really is here with us now, and it's something that each of us needs to commit ourselves to.
We've been talking a lot about presence in terms of ships, for instance, but surveillance is very important. Communication is very important. My understanding is that there are challenges in the North, particularly with communications because of satellite coverage.
Yeah.
Have those problems been solved? Are they being addressed? Or do we still have a major obstacle here to overcome?
I would describe, so Starlink is a great example of a key enabler that many of us are leaning on, have been game-changing. So Healy, I mentioned, she's up in the Arctic now. I get high-resolution pictures of polar bears from that CO above 70 degrees.
But what about the Chinese? Are they taking pictures of them?
But so there's vulnerabilities in those technologies as well. And so thinking about how we're investing in our satellite constellations, and I think the Space Force commander was here yesterday, right? There are real vulnerabilities in space as we consider contested environments. It's not just an at-sea challenge in the Arctic, but across domains, and I would add cyber, right? Space, cyber, all of it presents threat with regard to our ability to enforce our own national sovereignty.
So this is a really important issue that we worked a lot on recently, because classical geostationary satellites, stop working when you're above 79, 80 degrees. And now, because there's more activity in those remaining 10 degrees, you need to do something else. And Starlink is part of that, as long as Elon Musk is happy, I guess.
Yeah.
But what we have done is to invest much more now in polar satellites, which are called Plenary, because they have this sort of elliptic route around the globe. And they are then taken down by a Norwegian company in Svalbard in the very north, and in Antarctica at the Troll Station, which are some of the largest recipient antennas for these satellites. And that gives us almost real-time coverage of what's happening there. But we need more of this, because we know the communications, we need the surveillance, we need to understand what's going on, and that will be a challenge still, even with these new investments.
Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of probably my priority issues when I was mayor for the city of Inuit, is that we struggle even, sometimes our CMP officers or posts will tell our community members, if you need our services, you need to come to the detachment. it is as critical as that. So lives are at stake. You're talking about search and rescue. One of the first things that you need is to be able to communicate. So Starlink absolutely has been a game changer. It reduced my internet bill from about $1,000 a month for my household down to $149, yay, and significantly more bandwidth. However, the challenge is that there aren't that many, and so you do have sort of capacity issues. The other reality is that we need to see fiber actually deployed into the Arctic. There was just a recent joint statement that was signed by many of our Western allies that recognizes that fiber is, of course, 99% of the world's communication travels on fiber, but there are some vulnerabilities there. But fiber can be upscaled to effectively also act as monitoring and surveilling what is coming near the cables. We're seeing with maritime requirements, the Arctic doesn't have an awful lot of maritime data. So satellites are great to figure out what's happening on the terrestrial or the surface of the water, but it can't tell you what's happening under the ice. It can't tell you what's happening on the seabed. What we can have is what's called a smart cable, science monitoring and reliable telecommunications by having sensors on those cables. But we can also have docking stations, and so the International Submarine, I'm trying to remember what their E stands for. ISE is a Canadian company, Cellula is a Canadian company, where the ability to actually autonomous docking. So you can have those unmanned underwater vehicles dock there, recharge, and dump the data. We need to know what's happening in the marine environment. The Arctic Ocean is 14 million square kilometers, and that is literally one of our biggest vulnerabilities.
And absolutely. And one of the most critical infrastructure types of critical infrastructure we have are these cables, both for sensors and for internet and for communication. But they can also be cut. And
yes, have been recently.
in my immediate vicinity, we have a little bit too much of that going on right now. Just reminding us that how dependent we are. I mean, I live in a country where I don't even know what money, physical money, looks like. I haven't seen coins or paper money for many years. I wouldn't recognize them. So everything is digital. But it depends on this infrastructure being there. So if other powers are also aware that we have these cables and this infrastructure, so it's become very important also to look after it and to have redundancy.
I would really love to take some audience questions if we have some out here. I see a question right here. We can get a microphone. Excuse my pointing. There we go. Name and quick question, please.
I'm Lobsang. I used to be the former president of Tibetan government exile. My quick question is, China's presence in Arctic, trying to weaponize Arctic. Is there potential for communication with Asian countries, the downstream Asian countries? Because Tibet, being the roof of the world, has major rivers flowing. But the downstream countries are very nervous because China is weaponizing all these rivers by damming them, and during war it might be weaponized as well. But the other question I also want to make is, Minister Blair talked about rare minerals being exploited by China. Tibet is very rich. 50% of the copper, gold of China, or 75% of lithium reserve is in Tibet. 80% of cotton is in Uyghur region. 90% rare earth is in Inner Mongolia. But Western companies, including Canadian companies, are investing and exploiting these rare minerals, thereby enabling, China to monopolize rare minerals. So that's not just Canada, America, Australia, even Europeans as well. What do you have to say to that?
Well, first of all, let me respond. I think it is necessary for the free world to wean itself from its dependence on China's dominance of the critical mineral industry. 85% of all critical minerals that Europe uses, for example, comes from China through their not just their extraction, but their processing. Not just in the countries in their immediate sphere, but all around the world. And they're attempting also to do it in our countries. And so it presents a particular challenge for us because when Canadian mining companies, for example, invest in the extraction and processing of critical minerals, there is a very aggressive approach sometimes to pricing in that market, which destroys our business model for those mines, takes us out of business, and then maintains that dominance of Chinese production. The only way around that is through collaboration among all of the allies and an agreement that we are going to do exactly what Europe was compelled to do, weaning itself from dependence on Russian energy. That we need a collective response, that we are prepared to work together and make commitments to each other to create the business model that allows us to wean ourselves from that dependence.
I mean, I think a mega trend now is that Western democratic countries have to re-engage with extraction, mining, and also production, processing, and production and industry. We thought during the heyday of globalization that we could do services and we leave that stuff to others. But then we realized that we became overly dependent on others, which we don't want to be dependent on. So this is really a big part of the conversation that we need to have. We have it in Europe. We need to have it with Canada, North America, and the US, because this is a shared challenge that we must avoid. This is not necessarily about protectionism. It's not an argument for that, but it's an argument for making sure that we also extract and produce things, materials and things. Otherwise, we will be outmaneuvered by other players, and that's a big deal.
We have
Maybe-
another question right here.
Okay.
Do you want to quickly chime in?
Just very quickly, it's just that as the Northern Director for Arctic 360, Canada's only Arctic think tank, we've been trying to actually reach out to the private sector to look at ways in which they can support the financing of the infrastructure in the Arctic. What is surprising is how much of our Canadian pension plans invest in China and not investing in Canada, let alone in the Arctic.
We have another question right here.
Hi, I'm Dolkun Isa. I'm the former president of the World Uyghur Congress. Well, yesterday at the opening, Peter says, and the Russian war against Ukraine is 1,000 days. General Barth says it is already 4,000 days. Anyway, 1,000, 4,000 days war is ongoing because Russia is not alone. China is behind this war, North Korea, particularly China, economically and also in the military. So just starting the war is Western countries, particularly is a NATO alliance countries, economic sanction against Russia is good. But it is mean just the front door is closed, but back door is open. Because if you look at, before the Ukraine war, China and the Russia economic volume is around $120 billion. Now, it's $250 billion. So it is this war, because this is the reason why Putin continue carrying on this war.
Do you have a
Do you
question
think,
for us?
is my question to ministers, and it is if is a country should economic sanction on China, it is the more effective way to stop on this war. Do you think it will be on your agenda soon, economic sanction to China, or yeah?
Let's get reaction.
Yeah, if I may. First of all, the sanctions against Russia were entirely necessary, and I think we should always continue to find ways to even make them more effective. The elimination of when Europe weaned itself from dependence on Russian energy, Russia in many ways is a criminal oil company, and they just simply sold their product to somebody else. And so getting around those sanctions. But having said that, we are also deeply concerned that the relationship that now is evolving between Russia and North Korea. I know it's deeply concerning to the Ukrainians, but it's also deeply concerning to the Republic of Korea, to the Japanese, and to all of the allies, because of what that could mean, not only an escalation in Ukraine, but an escalation on the Korean Peninsula as well. We believe that in many ways China is a facilitator of that relationship and a facilitator of Russia's efforts to reconstitute their military, to acquire weapons, utilize particularly missile technologies. And so we believe that there needs to be a concerted and united action directed towards encouraging China not to do that. Sanction may be an option. I believe there are many other options that our diplomatic community needs to explore to influence China not to continue to facilitate Russia's illegal aggression or, frankly, the wild card, which is North Korea.
We have another question here, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Could we get a mic down here?
Constanze Schlesien-Müller-Brookings for the Norwegian Foreign Minister, Espen Barth Eide. You mentioned Svalbard, which has a long-standing Russian and Chinese presence. And I had the privilege of opportunity of visiting Svalbard in August, courtesy of your defense ministry, which was memorable. But it's very clear that that whole area is becoming an object of special interest from authoritarian powers, especially Russia and China. Our allies, is NATO doing enough to allay Norwegian and other regional security concerns? What more should we be doing? What would you like to see on the agenda as soon as possible? Thank you.
So thank you, Constanze, and I'm happy you enjoyed the visit up there. It's quite an amazing place. Well, you know, I think for the moment this is quite well managed. We follow this very closely, of course. We have the Svalbard Treaty, and this is Norwegian sovereign territory, but we have a treaty allowing, you know, certain uses for all countries who signed the treaty. We respect that, but we're also very eager to underline that it has to happen under our overall control and under the rules that we set. So, you know, we cannot convince China not to take an interest in the Arctic. That, you know, China does have an interest in the Arctic, but we would much prefer that they continue to do their research, you know, on our research station under the rules that applies to that station, rather than to build with Russia an alternative. That requires a sophisticated approach, saying that you are welcome on our terms, where you already are with something called the Yellow River, not a station, but the part of a Norwegian-run station. And we much prefer that to having this somewhat wild idea of a kind of an alternative BRICS research station. So this is something we spend a lot of time on. I think it's well managed for now. I don't think there's a NATO role for that specific issue, but I am very much in favor of, as you have understood, that we put more of our attention on what's happening in the Arctic more in general, and recognizing that all, you know, every part of Canada, every part of America, every part of Norway and other Nordic countries who are in NATO is NATO territory. NATO does not end at a certain latitude. It's all NATO.
We have another question right here.
Thanks. Terry, Royal Navy. I would like to try and bring a question together for all three panels this morning. So the last panel talked about the lack of security and actually kind of made it out that democracies were actually bad for security, which is bad for the first panel. This panel would suggest the same. How do we... the first question is, I disagree with the our Arctic. It's the world's Arctic, and so us approaching it as our Arctic is probably a bad way to start. And it's actually for the Minister. How do we get ourselves out of a 4-year, 2-year cycle? Because one of the reasons autocracies are really good is because they're able to have a real long-term strategy. If we had a real long-term strategy, Admiral Fagan would not only have one icebreaker, she would have more. We would be much more in the Norway region of managing relationships because you have to, because that's where you live. So how, Minister, do we get ourselves out of a democratic cycle, which means that every 2 or 4 years the world changes? Because if we don't approach it strategically, we will not win.
I think one of the great strengths, but also one of the great challenges of being part of free democracies around the world is that we are also a little captured by electoral politics. It is the situation we deal with, and some of our adversaries, China in particular, takes a centuries-long view to their aspirations and goals, and that can be somewhat more challenging for us. I might suggest that the best approach is to turn it away from a political discussion and make it national and international discussion among allies and friends. And I honestly believe it's a conversation we all need to have with our citizens about what is required and what we need to do. And I very sincerely believe that if my countrymen and women believe this is the right thing to invest in and the right thing to do, no future government can ignore that imperative. And so that's the conversation we are trying to initiate with our own citizens. And I will also share with you, I've been enormously encouraged by the change in thinking even within our own country. because people are realizing that we have a responsibility there, and there's a right way to do it, and it's going to require significant new investment to do it right. And it is when our citizens believe this is the right thing to do, then it will not be negatively impacted by electoral politics, but the citizens will demand that any future government follows through on that commitment.
Maybe just to add is that often in Canada, there's a reluctance by Canadians who live 100 miles from the US border, which is 90% of our population, to invest in the Arctic. What I think is really important is to remind them that the investments in the Arctic, especially that are multi-purpose but with a strong security component, is protecting 440 million people. It is not just for the benefit of 150,000 people.
So allyships and partnerships are our competitive advantage. And we say that, but the reality is the strength is in the alignment and partnership across the nations represented here. China and Russia don't have that same competitive advantage.
There was one question back here I want to try and squeeze in. Could you raise your hand and tell us who you are?
Yes, good day. Darren Hawker with Deloitte, 36 years in the military. My point would be to this particular question from Jude is in a previous life, wrote a paper. The paper said depoliticize the support and development in the North. The manner to do that is apply a Danish defense agreement-like approach where all parties, as a function of the importance of security in Denmark, required a consistency in approach to NATO, irrespective of minority government formations. Let's depoliticize it. All parties get together. They negotiate a Danish defense agreement, not the use of the military of the day, but the resourcing of the military of the day. My paper and just really the argument, and I would be interested in the minister's perspective on how this could play in Canada, is to actually have a multi-party agreement in the North, and that would take all politics out of the matter.
Can I just inject here that we just this year we landed the 12-year defense investment plan, which is supported by every party in government, so completely across the board after good negotiations. And that is politics, but it's good politics because it's politics that actually reaches consensus. And these themes are very high on that in that defense plan. And I just wanted to the lady from the Royal Navy. Royal Navy is a very close partner and friend for the Norwegian Navy. Just one thing for a security conference is that with the return of geopolitical competition, navies, air forces, missile defense, even nuclear, is much higher on the agenda again. We used to talk about how is it going in deserts in faraway places, which were predominantly army operations. But these more classical security themes are now much higher again on the agenda. That will, of course, also influence investments and priorities.
We're out of time. I want to ask a really quick round-robin question. What are the consequences if we don't get this right?
I think the consequences are uncontemplatable. I think we have a responsibility to do what's required, but I don't want to always approach this from a fear-based standpoint. I think there's huge opportunity for us to actually create prosperity. The connection between security and prosperity for all of our countries and for the entire free world, I think, is very clear. And if we want to ensure for all of our citizens that assured prosperity, then we've got to make this investment. And I think there's strong and compelling reasons to do it. And I think we are presented with an opportunity because of that collective defense commitment and our alliances that we have a huge opportunity to get this right.
Yeah, we are very sovereignty and economic prosperity is at stake. And the strength and the value is in the partnership. And I am optimistic that we've got the opportunity and the collective will to not allow further erosion of the maritime governance, rule of law, the very things we've depended on as nations.
Very quickly.
So I firmly believe in the rule of law and also in defense and the connection between them, because all these issues are actually sorted out in the UN Charter and then UNCLOS. The thing is we have to stand up for them if they're challenged. So that connection could not be more important than the time we live up to, but then we have to take a principled stand on respecting rule of law wherever it's violated, and also stand up when necessary with force if that is needed.
Madeleine, last word.
We are a weak link, the Arctic, because we are very insecure and we do not enjoy prosperity. And if we don't do anything, what are we protecting?
On that note, Madeleine Redfern, Minister, and Linda Fagan, Admiral, and Minister Blair, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand things over to Peter right now.
If I could just ask everybody to keep seated for a moment. Thank you. Thank you. Once again, it's my great honor to invite the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, Speaker Ruslan Stefanchuk, to the podium. Thank you.
Dear Mr. President, dear ladies and gentlemen, Halifax International Security Forum is an international recognized platform for comprehensive discussion of international security issues. It is also the place for developing wise solutions. The solutions that make our world safer and more secure. As I said yesterday, I am deeply grateful to each of you for the assistance and support provided to Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. But I have come to you not only for wise decisions. We need brave and just decisions. I will not hesitate to say historic decisions. It is exactly such decisions that must be timely made in Halifax, Ottawa, Washington, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, and London. Ukrainian people in the Ukrainian cities of Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kryvyi Rih, Sumy can't wait to see such decisions. Just a few days ago, the number of representing the days of Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine became a 4-digit figure. This brings in a new reality that requires new approaches. On one hand, we have 1,000 days of Ukraine fighting on the battlefield. On the other hand, we have 1,000 days of hesitation, procrastination, and sanction with loopholes. Many find this figure frightening. They think that it indicates that Russia is not stopping. My question is, have we done enough to stop this figure from growing? Ukrainians ask a lot of rightful questions. Ukrainians ask, why Ukraine, which is fighting to protect the universal democratic values, does not get the due protection from the democratic world? Why are we still unable to secure our own skies with the help of our allies? Why are we not allowed to use Western-supplied weapons against all legitimate military targets in Russia? Why do the rockets, bombs, and drones that kills Ukrainians around the clock still contain a lot of components made in Western countries? Why was Russia allowed to use an interconnectional ballistic missiles against the city of Dnipro just a few days before the 30th anniversary of the Budapest Memorandum? The absence of clear answer to this question only prolonged the suffering of the Ukrainian people. The absence of clear answers and decisive actions only strengthened Putin regime. The regime that grabbed unlimited power, the regime that kills opposition leaders, the regime that invaded Georgia, the regime that brutally interfered in the internal affairs of Azerbaijan and Armenia, the regime that made a turbulent situation in Moldova, the regime that annexed Belarus, the regime that brought together the axis of evil and used their unit force against Ukraine. I've just mentioned a lot of geographical names. Geography we can't change, but we can change the course of history. We can change it with resolute, decisive action. At the immediate level, with fast deliveries of Patriot and other air defense systems, with the delivery of long-range missiles and additional artillery, with the supply of combat aircrafts, with the equipment of a new brigades we have formed. I'm grateful to Canada for the delivery of the NASAM system. It's already on the ground in Ukraine. The next decisive action. Ukraine must become a member of NATO. As outlined in the victory plan of the President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's membership in the North Atlantic Alliance is not only a guarantee of security for Ukraine, but also a safeguarding for its future existence. For some, it's about making decisions. For us, it's about surviving. The sanction pressure on Russia must be significantly increased. The sanction regime must become total, without any exception of loopholes. I often say that we can't wait for the next sanction package as for the introduction of new version of the iPhone. We don't need the sanction package 60, 60 Pro, 60 Pro Max, etc. There must be just one true sanction package, immune to any loopholes. The frozen Russian assets must be used to compensate the huge losses caused by the Russian war. Dear friends, I think it's a high time to hand Putin the bill for this war, and he must start paying it. Dear friends, Ukrainians are forced to defend their freedom and independence. They are dreaming about peace. We want peace like nobody else. We want just and lasting peace. But we understand that peace can only be forced upon Russia. Please, treat this seriously and responsibly. This can finally bring peace to Ukrainians. I truly hope that next year, with Canada taking over the G7 presidency, we will mark the return to peace to Ukraine. Canada can and must fulfill its historic mission. Dear friends, here in Halifax, we talk a lot about values and the protection of values. I believe that Ukrainians have added new meanings to such values as freedom, democracy, and justice. You often say that Ukrainians are heroes. We are grateful for that. But Ukrainians want to call you heroes. Heroes for your brave decision, for your timely action, and unwavering resolve. People say you can truly value something only when it's lost. I sincerely hope that the democratic world will grasp the true meaning of freedom and democracy without having to lose them. And finally, dear Peter, Mr. President, Ukrainian soldiers have a cherished tradition of exchanging their unit's patches with their comrades in arms as a demonstration of unity. The Latin inscription on this patch reads, "A heavy armor of warrior is better than light collar of slave." These words explain for everyone what it means to be Ukrainians. Dear Peter, allow me to present you with this patch.
Thank you, Commandant.
Thank you. Dear friend, thank you for your attention, and Slava Ukraini. Thank you.